I was gonna do Sonic the Hedgehog 1, but died in Marble Zone and realized that I'd have to play the game quite a bit in order to beat it without save states. And since most people I know who like it enjoy it because they have to learn the levels and whatnot, that only feels fair. So instead of doing that right now, I'm gonna do Sonic the Hedgehog 4, one of the most hated Sonic games. Going into this, there's very little I actually know. I know there are a lot of gimmicks in this game, the physics are weird, the art style is eye-melting, at least for the first episode, and then each episode only has 4 zones, which I think is fine, but I know a lot of people disliked. Disliking the episode format makes total sense, but I think it was better for this game in particular, just because of the quality difference between the 2 episodes. Anyway, let's get into the game. I expect to dislike it as a whole, but find a few things that make me enjoy this game way more than I expected, just because that's been my experience with most Sonic games, such as Forces, 3D Blast, and even Shadow the Hedgehog. The game opens with something that I personally think is honestly pretty charming. It's a low frame rate graphic of Sonic wagging his finger. I think it's cute, and the model here doesn't look nightmarish like it does in the game itself. As soon as you press New Game, the game throws you into the first zone, Green Hill. Splash Hill. Your obligatory green place, your Green Hill, Emerald Hill, whatever. This was before Sonic Generations, before most people considered it outplayed, but I don't think that necessarily excuses it. Sure, Sonic 1 and 2 both had a green zone for the first stage, but Sonic 3 had Angel Island, which was, sure, green, but also had a pretty unique aesthetic. Sonic Adventure had Emerald Coast, Heroes had Seaside Hill, Shadow had Westopolis. Okay, fine, I won't bring up Shadow again until the Shadow retrospective. Anyway, I wish they had done something a little bit more unique, like Sonic 3 instead of just another Green Hill. But in all honesty, it really doesn't bother me that much. The stage theming generally doesn't affect my personal enjoyment of a game while I'm playing it, and the gameplay is what really matters. Either way, I do like that it just dumps you into the game. Even the sprites, at least I assume they're sprites, pre-rendered like DKC, since I'm playing at 2K and they look extremely low resolution relative, their terrible lighting doesn't really bother me that much. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't look good, but it doesn't change my experience with the actual gameplay. The first stage doesn't have a specific gimmick, it just introduces you to the game's controls in a safe, simple environment. It stops you pretty quickly after picking up speed for the first time, showing this game is going to be a lot more stop and go than the classics, which is honestly more to my taste. This means I can focus on slower platforming, since platforming and speed really don't go well together. See my Sonic Unleashed retrospective for more elaboration. This wasn't actually the first time the homing attack was seen in a 2D Sonic game. It was in Sonic Colors for the DS, and Rush in a much more neutered form. Plus, Colors for the Wii is basically a 2D Sonic game. And I'm really glad they brought it back here. Not only does it fit really well with the stop-and-go level design, it really adds to the flow of the platforming. It makes killing enemies easier, sure, but that means they can focus more on adding difficulty to the platforming rather than the enemies, and it leads to a more enjoyable first experience, which is severely lacking in a lot of other 2D Sonic games, including the classics, and infamously in something like Sonic Advance 2, as well as Unleashed in Adventure 2, which I have expressed immensely. Once you get used to the design language, where it doesn't expect you to keep your speed for long periods of time, but instead keep up the flow by knowing when to slow down, the stage is pretty standard and acts as a good intro to the game. One big thing I knew before playing this game was how much people hated the physics, but I didn't have too much of an issue with them. You don't roll down slopes as easily, but that serves the level design as much as it serves not going backwards because you barely missed a platform. If you did fall back down, you just charge the spin dash and go back on your way. It's nothing but a waste of time. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for losing a good time though, since being on the slope already slows you down. Because the stage is so heavily based on knowing when to slow down and speed up, speeding up isn't a chore anymore. I know preserving your momentum is kind of a big thing in the classics, but I'm glad they took this in a different direction, since it kind of ruins the first playthrough. You can still do it in this game, it just takes different techniques. There are even boosters to help you along so you don't have to sit there charging the spin dash like you did if you didn't want to blindly fly into obstacles in Sonic 2 and 3. A lot of people complain about the boosters because it plays itself or whatever, but it really doesn't. You still have to pay attention and react. The game just helps you along when you don't know the stage at all yet, and they serve to bolster the connection between the level design and expected playstyle. The point threshold for the extra lives is also a lot lower than the classics, or at least easier to reach. I don't know the exact numbers. This is a good thing, in my opinion, since extra lives are anachronistic anyway, but removing them outright would have been better. If you have 50 rings at the end of the stage, you can enter a special stage just like Sonic 1. Also just like Sonic 1, the special stages see Sonic rolling through weirdly abstract mazes made of geometric shapes. Unlike Sonic 1 though, you can actually control these instead of jumping and hoping you make it to the Emerald before running full force into an exit that you couldn't see coming. And even if you could have, it would have been impossible to avoid. Now you have full control over the tilt of the stage and can guide Sonic through it. These are actually one of my favorite special stages in any of the games because, for one, you can actually control it. I'm looking at you too, Sonic Heroes. You can also see and properly react to what's coming. Plus it's a unique gameplay style and is fun to do. Sonic Manias were alright, but it just made me want to play Sonic R. Sonic Colors DS were fine, but boring. Blue Sphere is fun, but I'm bad at it, so I have a personal bias against it. Anyway, there are 7 of these throughout the game, because 7 emeralds, and you can enter them from any stage. Plus, you can revisit them at any time through the main menu, which I really like. They can be slightly motion sickness inducing, and I certainly wouldn't want to play them on a car ride, but they aren't too bad. Splash Hill Act 2 is subtitled High Speed Athletics. Oh yeah, the acts have subtitles. The first one was The Adventure Begins. Act 2 probably has this subtitle because of the main gimmick here, vines you swing on. They're dependent on your angle and speed, which is better than Sonic Heroes vines, and it feels great to homing attack into one only to actually carry that speed into a jump and go flying towards the next vine. It can be difficult to know where you're supposed to go from certain vines, but it can be generally ascertained from context clues such as springs that launch you into the vine in the first place or other vines around it. The worst example of the vines, in my opinion, is the very last set of them. There are 4 vines over a pit of spikes just before the end, so I'd swing up to the 3rd one, then jump up to the 4th, then try to swing from there to the ledge leading to the end. The only problem is, this is either extremely precise or simply not possible. It's much easier to swing from the 3rd vine up to the ledge. I think that 4th vine leads into this area from a different route through the stage, but there really should have been a trail of rings or something leading from the 3rd vine, especially because of how liberally they use rings to guide the player otherwise, which is another thing I actually really like about the stage design in general. Other than that specific moment though, I like the stage enough. I actually played it twice in a row to get to the special stage from this act so I could get them all as early as possible, since I lost all my rings to that last pit of spikes. This really highlighted to me how much faster you can get through stages when you've already played them, and how much easier it is to actually remember how to get through stages quickly in this game because of the uniqueness throughout the stage, compared to the classics at least. I was able to get through this stage a minute faster despite even getting stuck at one point. Oh yeah, you can select stages after you complete them to replay them. It makes getting the Chaos Emeralds, learning stages, getting good scores and times, all that stuff far less tedious than in the classics. Granted, you could argue that it makes it easier, but I'd trade tedium for difficulty any day. I don't think a game being easy on your first playthrough, or at all, is necessarily a bad thing either, and this is coming from someone who has over 300 hours in the first Dark Souls alone. As long as it's fun, that's what matters, and this stage is fun in my opinion. The flow is just far better than the classics, and is good in general in my opinion, on top of actually being learnable in a way that the classics would have required extensive replaying. The nature of slowing down consistently for platforming also really helps the memorization aspect. Blowing through and getting lucky or blowing through and instantly dying don't really lend to memorization, but slowing down and paying attention to the platforming does, and lets me go much faster next time, if I want to replay the stage for an emerald or even just for fun. Act 3, Sunset Dash, makes the color palette warmer, emulating the sunset, fittingly. You don't actually see the sun setting, but that doesn't really matter anyway. This was the first time that the game's physics differing from what I was used to hindered my experience in any way. I pressed down while coming off of a loop, since that's how you preserve speed in the classics, but instead it slowed me down to a dead stop before even reaching the top of the next, very low slope. I don't hate this, I think it adds more choice to becoming a ball, as it was almost always the best choice in the classics. It gave you more speed, it made it so you could kill enemies, it was always safer to be in a ball than sprinting down or even up a slope. In this game though, it slows you down if you're going up a slope. It does speed you up while going down though, and I think that's a good thing, since it just feels intuitive. It isn't what I'm used to, but I think it'll be easy enough to get used to, especially since you can use a spin dash to get straight back into it anyway, while still suffering the time penalty of making a mistake in platforming. I really just want to hammer home that the spin dash doesn't remove skill from the equation like I've seen many people say. It just removes the frustration and tedium from the learning curve. The gimmick for this stage is the ziplines, which feel really good because they have a minimum speed, which means that if you're going too slow they'll speed you up. But they'll also preserve your momentum if you're going faster, so they just feel good to use. The stage also has an instance of why the stop and go formula is good, actually. If you stop at a specific point, you'll get an extra life, but if you don't need it and already know the layout of the stage, you can keep your speed up, so it's a trade-off. If you know the game, you get less lives and therefore a harder experience, to a point. If you don't know the game, you go slower and you also get more lives for an easier experience. Immediately afterward, I got to use the extra life because the camera doesn't pan down as fast as you go down during descending homing attack chains, and I wasn't focusing enough to notice that there was a flower on the edge of my screen, so I didn't react fast enough. This camera issue seems persistent, it happened a lot to me, and it's one of the only real complaints I have with the game so far aside from the visuals, but it's not pervasive, since using a homing attack after a chain will usually keep you safe anyway. The boss gets its own act in this game for some reason, but I actually like this since it means there are more places to enter the special stages so you don't have to keep replaying stages or whatever. The boss is similar to Sonic 1's first boss, but the homing attack pushes you all the way to the edge of the screen when you use it, meaning you have to be more careful with your timing. You could also just not use the homing attack and it behaves almost exactly the same. Once the boss takes enough hits, it will swing the ball in a full circle and slam it down on you, which is new. I like this. It's subversion despite the familiarity, and it helps you understand the role the homing attack will play in the future. I'd also like to point out here that I really like Sonic's animations in this game. They feel smooth and characterized, as well as being highly stylized, which is good, in my opinion. If the shading was better, I think this game would look pretty good. The next zone is Casino Street, and big surprise, the gimmick of the pinball flippers permeates all 3 acts. It's a Sonic game, what do you expect? On top of this, each act has its own gimmick. Act 1 has a big focus on pinball as a whole, as well as a couple slot machines. Pinball slots. What's with this theme? Like, I know it was done in the classics, but where did it come from? I did some quick searching and couldn't find anything in real life like this. The closest I could find were some slot machines with pinball themes. Anyway, the stage is alright, way better than Spring Yard Zone because you can actually control Sonic, especially with the air dash. The air dash is the best side effect of the homing attack by far. You can get up to speed with it if you don't want to wait for the spin dash, get over gaps easier, it allows for tighter timed platforming, especially with how low the acceleration in this game otherwise, which also allows for finer control. It's great. It even lets you slow down if you're going too fast. There's so much utility in what's ostensibly a side effect of another revolutionary move. The stage is very much designed with the game's physics in mind. They certainly weren't a mistake, you just need to understand how to use them because they're so different from the classics. The flippers are strange as you can't actually use them unless you're touching them, so you can't preemptively move them to catch Sonic or anything. The stage is designed around this though, so it's fine, if slightly limiting. There are also quite a few moving platforms, which I would think are bad if the game seemed to focus on speed like the classics, but because it's conditioned slowing down for the platforming, they actually fit really well into the theme of the game as a whole. The gimmick of Act 2 is cards. You flip cards as you pass them in a stage, and once you get 3 matching symbols, you get whatever that symbol is. There are only rings and lives, so you get tons of lives in this stage, but again, that's not really a bad thing. There are also card platforms that flip on a cycle, and I like this because cycles are generally fun, especially when there are games about speed. They encourage you to get the best cycles possible, but they diminish discouragement because you can only get such a good cycle anyway. It's the best of both worlds, at least to me. It might just be the Marble Lit Up's corruption breaking through, but regardless, I like them. There are even paths made of cards. You homing attack the top card 3 times and they extend into a path, not unlike the light paths in Starlight Carnival. I like this, it's a cool theme and it looks nice enough, even if looks aren't this game's strong suit. There are pillars of cards in the background that spin as you pass them that make a really good noise too. There are even card platforms that flip after you touch them to encourage speed. They're really going hard on this theme, and it does nicely to give the level a unique identity, making it more memorable than a lot of other specific acts. They tend to blend into their zone in my experience. Actually, this game is doing a good job of that throughout so far, keeping acts unique despite the similar aesthetics of each zone, which the classics fail at miserably. The next gimmick we're faced with is cannons. Unlike the other iterations of cannons throughout the series, we have full control over these no matter what. They aren't a reaction test, spectacle, anything. They're a genuine, full mechanic that you can make use of. You jump into the cannon, aim the cannon, and shoot it whenever you want. This is one gimmick so far that I wish was iterated on more throughout the stage. Generally, a gimmick is introduced, slowly ramps up in difficulty, and culminates into an iteration that's either difficult or shows off some interesting mechanic that you can only experience with effective mastery over the gimmick, like the final section of the Vines in 1-2 or the final section of card platforming in 2-2. Instead, here it's just a big room with a bunch of cannons and you just need to find your way out. It's not difficult at all, it can be a little tedious, but it's small enough that it doesn't outstay its welcome, and when you come back to replay the level, you already know where to go. The gimmick doesn't flow well at all, unlike the rest of the gimmicks so far, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, only because it's an outlier and the difference in pace is almost refreshing, like Marble Zone can be in Sonic 1 for instance. There are a lot of moving platforms in the stage, which would be a bad thing if the stage didn't already set the precedent of being slower than other stages. It just feels better than when they show up in other Sonic games, especially the 3 columns of platforms moving up and down against each other. These feel terrible in the classics, but feel perfectly fine here. This stage also uses the spring enemy to get to a bonus area. I haven't really brought it up before now because it's usually nothing more than an obstacle, but here it's actually used in a unique and fun way. The boss for this zone is Eggman floating in the middle of a pinball table. If you stand still on the bottom, he'll grab you and drop you onto spikes. After a few hits, he'll create an arc under him so you have to attack him from the top. And finally, he'll start bouncing around the arena. You can just go under the flippers to completely avoid him, but you need to be careful about when you're attacking or take him out before he has the chance to use this move in the first place. Don't get me wrong, it's not hard, but it isn't a bad boss either. Lost Labyrinth Act 1 is surprisingly good. This stage has balls, which is probably the most infamous gimmick in the game, but they control fine once you get the hang of them. That's the hard part, learning them, but once you do, they're really simple. The only time you actually have to know how to use it is at the very end though, so you can get through the whole stage, learning it in a safe environment, being put on a slower path if you fall, and then learn it at the end for the next time you play the stage, which means a big dopamine boost when you get a huge personal best. Outside of the balancing though, it's a pretty solid stage all around. There's plenty of momentum-based platforming, faster paths for the next time you play, sections that get you to slow down to make sure you know what you're doing, but you can still go fast through if you already know. It's great. It was reminiscent of, fittingly, Labyrinth Zone from Sonic 1, which scared me, but was better than it in every conceivable way. There are parts where you're running through ankle-deep water, but it's purely aesthetic. I like the reimagining of this theme, honestly, mostly because of how rare it is in Sonic games, as opposed to Green Hill and Casinos. This entire game seems derivative, but everyone loved Sonic Generations, so it's clearly not inherently bad. There are even moving platforms that go in a circle that can be skipped entirely with homing attack chains, but they aren't easy to do, despite criticisms I've heard in the past, so it's not just a free, faster time. Act 2 is the first genuinely bad stage. The main gimmick is darkness, Sonic is holding a torch throughout the whole stage, and you have a small ring of light around you. This means you're constantly going slow so as to not get hit, or you go fast, fall in a random pothole with no telegraph, and get slowed down anyway. It's unfair to expect players to memorize the locations of so many tiny little holes that only slow you down to have fun in a stage. Because of the darkness, too, the platforming generally isn't very interesting, especially compared to the rest of the game. There are segments where you have to light sconces to make things happen, essentially solving puzzles, which are interesting, but they're tainted with the entire rest of the stage. If there were a couple segments where you have to carry a torch into an area to solve a puzzle, maybe avoid water for it or something, that could be interesting, but because the torch permeates the entire level with huge platforming segments purely in the dark, it's kind of ruined. The torch is also used to light explosives that open up paths, but most of them are entirely superfluous as they only serve to make you wait with no skill-based way to avoid it. There is one section where you actually have to try to remove a wall, but it's too little too late. There's a minecart in this level, which breaks the tradition of introducing one gimmick to each stage, but it's largely unobtrusive. You ride it a few times, the first being a reaction test to take the higher path, the second being pure spectacle, and the third actually expecting you to jump. But it's telegraphed with signs, so it's fine. It's not like they drastically slow you down or anything. I got to the final Chaos Emerald at the end of this stage, and the game crashed right afterward, but I choose to believe that it was the stage's fault, just because it was the worst one so far by a long shot. The third act's gimmick is water. Of course it's water. It's slow, it's timed, and I actually don't hate it in this stage. Generally, water stages are really frustrating, slow, annoying, but here it's alright. The bubbles are placed in such a way that you will reach one on time if you just keep moving through the stage. Going quickly through the water is incentivized and encouraged by boosters in the air dash, and even required at one section with a wall chasing you threatening to crush you, and there are no annoyingly timed obstacles like the spikes in normal Labyrinth Zone. The water slides, like the ones you see in Hydrocity or even Oil Ocean, are used for a pretty interesting gimmick where the area keeps looping and you need to notice that you're supposed to jump off. There is one section where you have to tilt the entire screen, and it isn't telegraphed that it's what you're supposed to do, but I figured it out by just pressing buttons. It happens the second time with spikes, and I have no idea how you're supposed to do it, but this was the first stage where I used Supersonic. It was only for the last quarter of the stage, which was mostly taken up by a puzzle, but I'll avoid using it from here on out so I can get a better understanding of the stages. The boss is pretty similar to the boss of Sonic 1's Labyrinth Zone, where you have to chase Eggman through an underwater section, but you actually fight him at the end by jumping on moving pillars without getting crushed. It's pretty easy, all things considered, but I actually died here because the pillars are instant death. You have to redo all the platforming if you die here, but it's only about a minute of platforming, so it's kind of a non-issue. I noticed here that Eggman doesn't move at all while he's exploding, and it's objectively hilarious. Mad Gear Zone Act 1 really does not have a good first impression. You do some platforming, are introduced to the gimmick of the stage, steam vents that propel you in the direction they're facing, do a bit more platforming, then are launched directly in front of one of the praying mantis enemies and are given no time to react to it. Granted, they're less annoying than other incarnations, since you have the homing attack to deal with them much more effectively, but I don't think it's fair to expect someone to even come close to reacting to that, especially since it's the first time seeing that enemy. Otherwise though, it's a fine enough stage. There's nothing else like that with the praying mantis enemies. The gimmick is used well and in diverse scenarios, and the platforming is alright. Sometimes the steam vents will launch you into spikes or enemies, but it's always telegraphed beforehand, so there's nothing else actually bad here. There are also pistons that can crush you and instantly kill you, but again they're telegraphed pretty well and don't ever blindside you. This is just a solid stage, and I really don't have much to say about it. The zone is obviously derivative of Metropolis Zone, but it's better in every conceivable way from what I've seen of this stage, having never actually played it myself outside of maybe on the DS Classic Collection using save states years ago. Anyway, it's a solid stage. The only thing I really don't like is at one point a piston pushes you straight into spikes that you definitely can't see coming. It doesn't kill you, if you have rings at least. Mad Gear Act 2's gimmick is, unsurprisingly, or the opposite if you expected this in the last stage, gears. Gears that constantly rotate at a very low frame rate, and gears that you run on to make them spin and move or open doors, usually both. The gear platforms not rotating smoothly is really strange. I wish they did, but it's not a deal breaker. They still behave exactly as you'd expect them to. I assume this was for optimization? I have no idea. It's strange, but not a deal breaker by any means. The rotating gears are fine. They start off slow, but there are only a few of them throughout the stage, and they're not agonizing. The doors they open are only open for a limited time too, adding opportunities for interesting timed platforming, which they certainly capitalize on. There was one time that I just ran off of one of the gears, but you do stick to it, and I jumped, so it's kind of on me. There are moving platforms here, but they don't break the pace of the stage because you can just jump up to a higher one due to how densely placed they are. There is one section of the stage that I didn't like where there are pistons moving extremely quickly and are very difficult to pass without instantly dying, but I'm sure this is just a skill issue and there's an alternate path to skip them entirely, so oh well, I guess. Act 3 is really interesting. It does have its own gimmick. You're constantly being chased by a moving wall of drills that can damage you on contact and crush you against a wall if you aren't fast enough. On top of this though, it also uses both gimmicks from the other Mad Gear acts, meaning it's a test of skill for everything you've learned throughout the zone as a whole. I wish this was the game's modus operandi from the very beginning, honestly. Except for Lost Labyrinth, doing platforming in the dark with an oppressive time limit or it being any more difficult in any state would have been annoying. Having more pinball tables would probably have been a bad thing too. You know what, I'm fine with this only being here. It's an interesting capstone to the game and mercifully ends the trend of Sonic games having terrible final zones like Eggman Land or the entirety of the final act in Sonic Adventure 2. There are constantly pistons that close as you approach. Not only do you have to be fast overall, you also have to go fast enough through each individual platforming challenge that has these pistons that don't open back up. The stage flows well enough, aside from one section near the end. There's a spring that launches you over one of these pistons, and there are other pistons in front of it that you have to pass, leading me to attempt to jump between them, but you actually only have to jump for the final set, and if you jump pretty much anywhere else you get crushed or stopped and crushed by the giant wall. This part is way more trial and error than anything else in the game, but I'm willing to not rag on about it just because it's the final zone and I have 60 lives anyway. It is a huge jump in difficulty though, definitely unprecedented. The act also has these tilting platforms that Sonic turns into a ball on, and you control the set of platforms that you're on instead of Sonic himself. They completely break the pace of the level, but they also force you to slow down while still expecting you to react, which is novel. The momentum of them is very strange, but otherwise they're fine. The boss consists of Eggman being surrounded by a bunch of weird little eggs? They have tiny exploding Eggmen in them, which is strange, and every time you hit one instead of Eggman himself, they hatch into the exploding Eggman. After doing enough damage, he runs away and you have to give chase. He'll throw more Eggmen at you, and you just need to dodge them and hit him enough times. There are small but extremely fast blue ones that are really hard to dodge, and the giant yellow ones that are surprisingly easy to dodge. Also, Eggman's arms are extremely long in this game, like, wow. The final zone is just a boss rush. You fight the first boss, then the second, third, and fourth all in sequence with no differences other than less health, except for the fourth one where you don't fight the first phase and he throws mines on the floor on top of all the bouncing Eggmen. You then fight the Death Egg robot from Sonic 2, with a couple differences. First of all, it has way too much health. I have no idea how much health it has in Sonic 2, but my winning attempt took me 4 minutes on this boss alone. Luckily there are checkpoints. If there weren't, I would have lost my mind here. This boss has a huge jump in difficulty compared to all the others, but in a way that you can definitely learn. It will raise its arms and become impervious for a moment, but it has an adequate tell. It rocket jumps up, tries to land on you, then walks towards you while you attack it. It can shoot its arms at you, and again it has a good tell. Then the second phase kicks in. It's constantly covered in electricity, so you can't attack it directly. It starts jumping all over the screen, and you have to go under it, which is ridiculously tight timing compared to everything else so far. When it shoots its arms at you, they shoot towards you, then upwards, which makes it way harder to dodge. Then you have to attack the arm 3 times, it hits Eggman, then you can damage it. After doing this a couple times, it starts shooting projectiles as it flies upward, and then shoots a weird beam after shooting its arms. Luckily, it can be dealt with only one cycle of this, then it jumps up and lands in a random spot on the platform, dying to one more hit. Again, the difficulty isn't really the issue, it's just how much health it has. The boss is incredibly tedious and takes way too long to kill. Well, either way, the final cutscene teases episode 2, and the game ends. That was one hell of a game. I liked it way more than I was expecting to, and I genuinely think this game was simply overlooked because of the poor art style, and the only people who played it were die-hard Sonic fans who wanted something like the classics, and so they tore into it for all the minor problems it has and because it isn't like the classics. This seems likely to me because the achievement percentages on Steam are weird. Only half the players beat the first boss, and only 12% beat the game, with 8% getting all the Chaos Emeralds. The platforming feels really good throughout, it balances speed and platforming really well, the homing attack adds tons of options and opportunities for the devs to make new obstacles, the music all fits really well even if it isn't something I would listen to personally, and aside from the final boss and a couple other sections in certain acts, this is a really good game. My favorite that I've played for this series so far, even above Sonic Heroes. I guess that means it should also have an 8 out of 10, but that doesn't feel right. I mean, 8 out of 10 fits it, but Sonic Heroes should probably have a 7? I don't know, I'll figure out the ratings eventually. For now, Heroes is a 7, Adventure 2 is a 6, Unleashed is a 5, and this game is an 8. Since the art style doesn't really change my gameplay experience that much. I have seen the videos of people standing on walls and stuff in the game, but that didn't happen to me, and even if it had, it doesn't change the fact that I had a lot of fun with this game, and that's what matters most. This video was supposed to be like 10-15 minutes, just a short little video that I blew through, maybe did the second episode in the same video even, but that just didn't happen, clearly. I'm not gonna have any opportunity to do anything with YouTube for probably like a month, If I do get a free day, I'll try to do episode 2 before anything else. But rest assured, I will be back eventually. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I love you all, and I don't know how to end this.